Hi, today is Tuesday, July 1st, 2025. So we've just started the first day of the second half of this year, and there would be about 182 days left. I am super excited about that because I want this year passed as quickly as possible. And next Friday and another Friday after that, I have a day off. So basically, this month I have two free holidays. If I use my regular holidays, I can just rest a lot of days. Probably I would be traveling to China, Changchun or Shulan, some other parts, northeastern part of China, where many Koreans live, right? Korean Chinese. So I am super excited about that. Well, I'll just go back to Chongqing one more time and meet that Chinese Trump guy, China. He speaks very fluent English and he's good at mimicking Trump. So let's read this. What's in Trump and Senate Republicans' tax and immigration bill? The Senate is on the verge of advancing Trump's priorities in his major budget legislation. Here's how it could change the federal government and the U.S. economy. President Donald Trump meets with the GOP leaders in January, including from left, Vice President J.D. Vance, Tom Cotton, Arkansas, Senator John Barrasso, Wyoming, Senator Shelley Moore, Capito, West Virginia, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune, South Dakota, Craig Hudson for the Washington Post by Jacob Bogage. New tax breaks, massive spending on border security, cuts to social safety net programs, pullbacks on investments to fight climate change, new limits on student loans, new tax breaks, massive spending on border security, cuts to social safety net programs. Wow, cuts to social safety net programs, pullbacks on investments to fight climate change, new limits on student loans. That's a good expression. Cuts to social safety net programs. Cuts to social safety net programs. Pullbacks on investments to fight climate change. Pullbacks, cut. If it becomes law, President Donald Trump and congressional Republicans' massive budget bill will reshape much of the federal government and the U.S. economy. The House narrowly passed the legislation in May and sent it to the Senate, which took up the measure referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on Saturday. Republicans are trying to move quickly to reverse many of President Joe Biden's legislative accomplishments and cement Trump's legacy in the tax code on the U.S.-Mexico border and in generations-old anti-poverty programs. Social safety net programs. The legislation would devote hundreds of billions of dollars to finishing Trump's border wall, fortifying maritime border crossings, outfitting the Defense Department, and more. It would extend the tax cuts that were one of the signature legislative achievements of Trump's first term, create new savings accounts for newborns, and fulfill some, but not all, of the president's campaign promises. Major parts of Trump and Senate Republicans' tax and immigration package. Figures in red represent increases to the national debt over 10 years, and those in teal represent savings. In teal, right? In red, in teal, represent savings. Extended TCJA rates by $2.2 trillion. Increase the standard deduction by up to $2,000. Increase the child tax credit and link to inflation. Business tax breaks. Border wall and immigration restrictions. Defense spending. No tax on overtime. No tax on tips. Sunset. No tax on car loan interest. Rural hospital bailout fund. Savings accounts for newborns cuts to federal worker protections. New taxes on colleges and universities. Oil, gas, and coal production. Spectrum auction cuts to anti-poverty food assistance. Anti-poverty food assistance. Student loan changes. Raise salt cap to $40,000 for 5 years. Medicaid cuts. Spectrum auction, right? Spectrum auction. I'm a KT employee, so I'm just attracted to this word naturally. Spectrum auction. The Republican negotiations over the bill are far from over. The Senate overhauled the legislation in ways that make it unrecognizable to some House lawmakers. Trump and Senate leaders are banking on the House accepting those changes even if lawmakers in the lower chamber have concerns over myriad issues, including the social safety net and national debt. The GOP is using the budget reconciliation process to shepherd the measure, which allows them to dodge a Democratic filibuster in the Senate and pass it on party lines. Here's what the Senate version of the proposal: extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts. Trump's 2017 tax cuts and Jobs Act cut taxes for individuals of nearly all income levels, concentrating most of the benefits among the wealthiest earners and corporations. The business tax cuts are permanent, but the individual portions expire at the end of the year. So if Congress doesn't act, tax rates will go up on most households. The Republican bill would permanently extend the lower rates for individuals. That's good. Increase the standard deduction. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the standard deduction, which is the baseline amount of income filers can collect tax-free. This legislation would preserve that policy and add to it, increasing the deduction by up to $2,000 for married couples filing jointly and $1,000 for single filers, right, filing jointly, to $32,000 for couples and $16,000 for individuals. Yeah, single filers. Cuts to Medicaid. To meet budget goals, Republicans are making deep cuts and instituting eligibility restrictions on Medicaid, the federal health insurance program for low-income individuals and people with disabilities. Low-income individuals for people with disabilities, Medicaid. The Senate implements work requirements and new cost-sharing structures and puts strict limits on Medicaid provider taxes, duties that states charge medical providers, and a roundabout way of collecting more federal Medicaid dollars. Some in the GOP wish to use that policy to force states to jettison some immigrants from benefits rolls. Right? Jettison some immigrants from jettison rolls. And what is that? Roundabout way. Provide is a roundabout way of collecting more federal Medicaid dollars. Roundabout way. Jettison some immigrants from benefits rolls. Jettison some immigrants from jettison benefits rolls. Rural Hospital Bailout Fund to soften the blow of the provider tax limitations. The Senate created a $25 billion fund to stabilize rural hospitals and health clinics. The fund would begin in 28 when the new provider tax policies begin and sunset in 2032. That's good. Good expression, sunset. Sunset in 2032. Stabilize, right? Stabilize rural hospitals and health clinics. A little salt, S-A-L-T, in large capital. The bill quadruples the cap on the state and the local tax deduction or SALT, which lets filers write off the amount they paid in local taxes from their federal tax bill. After 5 years, the SALT cap would snap back down to $10,000. Write off, right? Write off. Disregard. Making sales, states pay for SNAP, SNAP, right? The legislation would cap a future expansion of SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. Well, I'm worried about my friend John in North Carolina. It would also pass on more of the cost for administering the program to state governments, potentially forcing local officials to decide whether to cut benefits or dig into their state and municipal budgets. States with higher rates of improper payments would be required to shoulder up to 15% of benefits costs. Today, states and the federal government even split the costs of running SNAP's operations. Beginning in 2027, the federal government would cover only a quarter of the cost. Increase the child tax credit for some. The child tax credit is a tax break for filers with children. The Republican measure would increase the credit to $200 per child from $2,000, then would link it to inflation. But not every family can qualify. The legislation limits eligibility to parents or guardians with Social Security numbers, essentially requiring claimants to be citizens or immigrants who have obtained valid Social Security numbers. That would mostly exclude non-citizen parents from claiming the credit on behalf of child who is a citizen. Right? Claimants. A border wall, other barriers, and immigration restrictions. The Senate version designates nearly $170 billion for the Trump administration's border and immigration crackdown. According to the Congressional Budget Office, more than $46 billion would go toward the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border and other fortifications, including at maritime crossings. More than $70 billion would go to building and maintaining detention centers to house and transport the families of deportees. Right? I don't know why here deportees maritime crossings. At maritime crossings, deportees. New taxes on colleges and universities. The legislation aggressively taxes income generated by the endowments of colleges and universities. Current law imposes 1.4% tax on those institutions. This bill creates a new system that would set varying tax rates depending on the size of the endowment per enrolled student. Endowment size per student tax rate: more than $500,000, but less than $770, 1.4%. More than $750,000, but less than $2 million, 4%. $2 million or more, 8% endowment size. Savings accounts for newborns. The personal proposal would give newborn babies $1,000 savings account that the legislation calls a Trump account. A previous version dubbed them Money Account for Growth and Advancement, or MEGA account. Parents and beneficiaries would contribute $5,000 each year to that account until the beneficiary is 31 years old. The idea mirrors a pitch from Democratic Senator Cory Booker, New Jersey, for baby bonds. Not bad. No tax on tips. Trump campaigned heavily on ending taxes on tips, and now that policy is in the bill. The legislation would allow a tax deduction for the total amount of tipped income received. It contains some guardrails to prevent highly compensated employees from claiming their earnings as tips, and specifically identifies food service, hair care, nail care, aesthetics, and body and spa treatments as professions eligible to receive the deduction. Food service, hair care, nail care, aesthetics, body, and spa treatments. No tax on overtime. Another of Trump's campaign promises, this provision would exempt the overtime wages from taxes through a new deduction. The legislation wouldn't allow deduction of overtime wages from tips or for highly compensated employees, and requires filers to use a Social Security number when claiming the deduction, deeming most undocumented immigrants ineligible. This legislation wouldn't allow deduction of overtime wages from tips or for highly compensated employees, and requires filers to use a Social Security number when claiming the deduction, deeming most undocumented immigrants ineligible. No tax on car loan interest. The bill would allow purchasers of American-made cars to deduct up to $10,000 in car loan interest payments for 4 years, an idea Trump talked about on the campaign trail and then returned to as his tariffs began to bite the auto industry. The tax filers earning more than $100,000 or $200,000 for married couples filing jointly, the loan interest deduction would phase out by $200 for every $1,000 of additional income. bonus deduction for seniors. Trump promised last year to end taxes on Social Security benefits. The bill doesn't include the provision, but it would add an extra $6,000 to the standard deduction for people over 65 years old. The policy would taper off as a recipient's income increased. The policy would taper off as a recipient's income increased, right? The policy would taper off as a recipient's income increased. 가정법, right? What if sentence? The policy would taper off if the recipient's income increased. Tax breaks for businesses. The legislation would make it permanent a trio of tax breaks corporations have been clamoring for. Bonus depreciation lets companies write off the expense of certain new purchases, such as new technology, equipment, or facilities. In the first year of use, research and development expensing allows firms to deduct the cost of those activities from tax bills. Third provision would allow businesses to deduct more of their interest expenses. The Senate would greenlight those provisions permanently, making them together one of the most expensive items in the bill. A lot of tax breaks. Billions for defense, including Trump's Golden Dome. There is roughly $158 billion in the bill for the Defense Department, spread over several priorities. $25 billion for the munition and defense supply chain, $329 billion for shipbuilding, and $34 billion for missile defense and space capabilities. That's partially for Trump's Golden Dome Continental Missile Defense System. Repeal Biden's student loan forgiveness. The legislation would save $320 billion over 10 years by repealing the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program and making other changes to loan repayments. Tax credits for homeschooling or private school. Homeschooling or private school. The bill includes up to $4 billion per year in tax credits that benefit people who donate to organizations that help families pay for private school tuition or homeschooling. It would create a 100% tax credit for donations to scholarship granting organizations, with the taxpayers fully reimbursed for their donations when they file their taxes. Yeah, similar here, right? Tax evasions. In Korea, if you give $100,000 won to local government, you can get fully recover the expense when you file taxes. It's rather automatic. Rescind money to fight climate change. The proposal would gut elements of Biden's signature 2022 climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act. It would eliminate a federal tax credit of up to $7,500 that consumers can receive for buying an electric vehicle. Republicans would also quickly phase out incentives for the production of clean energy, such as wind and solar power. That's interesting. It's complete opposite of what we are doing in Korea. New oil and gas and coal production. Natural Resources Committee would require the federal government to immediately begin selling leases for oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and the protected Alaskan wildlands. It would also force the Interior Department to approve more coal production and reduce regulations to make it cheaper to extract. Auction the spectrum. The wireless spectrum is necessary for everything from wireless technologies to military communications and radars. The legislation would renew the Federal Communications Commission's authorities to auction off bands of spectrum that the Congressional Budget Office says could raise $85 billion over 10 years. Cut protections for federal workers. The legislation would require an audit of dependents of federal employees on government health insurance plans. Earlier editions of the measure would have forced new federal employees to choose between accepting an at-will classification that would make it easier to be fired or putting more of their salary toward retirement and recalculated worker retirement benefits. Those provisions were removed. Raise the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling sets the amount of money the federal government would borrow to pay for expenses already incurred. The government technically clips the limit at the end of 2024, but the Treasury Department is taking extraordinary measures to put off the need to take on more debt. But those measures will expire sometime in August. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Friday refused to answer questions on an exact date, a break from previous administrations. The Senate bill would raise the debt limit by $5 trillion. Mariana Sotomayor, Mariana Alfaro, Laura Muckler, Paige Winfield, Cunningham, and Muriel Cornfield contributed to this report. Correction. A previous version of a chart in this article misstated the budget score for the senior bonus to the standard deduction. The chart has been corrected. What readers are saying, right? By Jacobo. Jacobo covers economic policy in Congress for the Washington Post, where he's worked since 2015. Contact him securely on Signal, right? Well, that's it. But before I go, I would like to go over the expressions that I marked to be remembered. The policy would taper off as a recipient's income increased. At maritime crossings, tiporees, claimants write-off to stabilize rural hospitals and health clinics. Sunset in 2032. Stabilize rural hospitals and health clinics. Sunset, right? As a roundabout way or sneaky way of collecting more federal Medicaid dollars, jettison some immigrants from benefits rolls. Single filers, spectrum auction, cuts to social safety net programs, pullbacks on investments to fight climate change. Cuts to social safety net programs, pullbacks on investments to fight climate change. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful Tuesday. Bye-bye.